this video, we're going to explore a very specific color range. In this case, it would be greens. I've got a figure here from Raging Heroes. This is a really nice, sort of a wood elf, heroic character, and it was perfect for all of these different types of greens. Greens that have more yellow, more blue, that are more saturated, less saturated, darker, lighter. These are all things that we're going to explore in this video. I have some colors out on the palette. Over on the dark end of the spectrum, I've got a Reaper Violet Shadow. It's actually a dark blue. I've got dark sea blue here. This is from Vallejo. This is a really nice, rich, greenish blue. This is emerald. This is another one of those saturated colors. Also from Vallejo is Verdigris. And here's another couple of highly saturated colors, especially the deep sky and the green sky. I'll be using these to make greens that are obviously more towards the colder end of the scale, more blue. And as we work this way, things start to get a little bit warmer. We have some German green uniform here. Another German uniform, only this time even more unsaturated, more grayed down. Back to a more intense color. It's deep yellow from Vallejo, and finally an ice yellow. This is to lighten colors, but to keep them from getting too chalky. So you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, we have 4 of these very rich, intense colors. We've got some less intense colors over here, and even on the dark end of the spectrum over here, these not necessarily quite as saturated. With the colors out on the palette, we can do some color swatches. Got a little piece of board here so that we can try out some of these greens. You can see they're arranged out on the palette. Things off to the left here tend to be much more bluish, and everything that's off to the right much more yellow. But the colors actually on the palette, you can start to see how the yellow, that deep sky, and the emerald, they tend to pop out right away. That's what makes these a little more saturated than, say, these greens. These actually probably have a little more red in them, and since red is an opposite of green, that's what makes them a little less pure, less saturated. And essentially they're dirty colors. They have a little bit of dirt in them. These, much more pure. So let's just grab a green out here and let's mix a few other colors with it. So this is one of those more neutral, grayed down greens. Let's start to mix in one of these somewhat more saturated colors, but this time towards the warm. This is the green sky. So I'm going to start over here and start to create a little bit of a color bar. So I'm going to say that's more towards the dark end. And you can see this is how I like to use my palette, to not just kind of dab in one color, keep throwing color into one area. I like to do this so that I can see pretty much the whole range of color right here on the palette. If I put it on here, I already know what my whole range is. I can kind of say, well, it's going to be the color on the light end of the scale. But as I keep mixing a little more of the green sky in each time I go back to the palette, put a little more of that green sky in. And you can see now I've got something called a value scale, which is really, that's another important aspect of understanding colors, is to know what's the light, what's the dark, and just as important, what's in the middle. So as I do these color bars, what I try and do is make sure that right down the center it's going to be the mid-tones. We'll have the lights and the darks. So you can see this is still somewhat muted. Let's take that same exact green, and I'm going to throw some of the yellow in that, some of that deep yellow, and that's going to really change this color around. It's not only going to be warmer than this transition that we just created, it's also going to be much more saturated. It's going to just pop out compared to the first transition that we created. So I'm going to do, just like I mentioned before, it's almost like you can predict the future here. You can see where you're going with your mixture. So more yellow. And as I keep working my way to the right hand side of this color bar and also towards the lighter side of the color bar, you can see now, especially at this point, just how different this is from our first color bar. Much more intense, much more saturated. Huge difference between these two. You still have a dark middle tone and a light, but not only is this much warmer, but it's more intense even towards the mid-tones, because the color that we just added to it is more saturated. I'm going to use that same green one more time, because it's obviously a green. But what happens if I add one of these blues? Let's go with the deep sky. I want to do this intentionally next to the yellow to really kind of enhance the visual effect of adding this intense blue to your green. I know there's many times where someone has a favorite sort of a turquoise green color, and for whatever reason those sometimes tend to be discontinued from paint lines. And that tends to make life very difficult for people. They try to find a substitute. Well, hopefully, by seeing some of these color swatches, it gives you an idea of ways to work around that just by finding your own color mixes. Now, once again, our starting point is the exact same green we started out with, but as you can tell by the time we reach these middle tones, now it's more of a blue, more of a turquoise. So as we work all the way over to the deep sky again, this is still more intense than this green. Now if we were to start with another green that's even warmer, such as this one, See, that almost looks brown compared to that bluish green. Here it looks green, but all of a sudden now this, even the paint jar said it was green, all of a sudden looks brown. And as we mix yellow with that, it's going to even more interesting. This could be kind of a good swampy green, or maybe really good for wood elves. Kind of a not quite fall, but maybe getting towards fall. So we're back to the yellow. Just a little bit more. So once again, this even more of a warm green than what we started up here with these. All of a sudden these look cooler. Even this one that we said was warm doesn't look as warm as this last swatch, because look at the green that we started out with. It's even more of a warm green. And finally you've got this emerald. Let's take, again, starting off with a green, but now adding the emerald. And this will be another of the more intense colors. Work this over towards the emerald, which you can see is really intense. So we've added another type of green. This is to me where a lot of the fun is. And just working around, playing around with these different greens. So let's start this actually very light. It's green, obviously, but when we add this Verdigris, obviously it's going to shift the color, not just lighten it, but also shift it towards a different temperature. So it's getting lighter. Lighter still, but also much cooler. So this is certainly not a blue. Definitely falls under the category of green, but certainly different than a lot of the other greens that we put out on this board. Much lighter. If you were to take that same green and mix it with yellow, again, an entirely different result. From this, again, starting point was the same, but we added yellow. Completely changes the transition around. If you were to take green and lighten it with that ice yellow, it's going to be quite different. It's almost going to look more like our first, the first color that we threw out on the board here. You can see very, very similar. This looks an awful lot like this. That's why I do these kind of things, to show you don't have to be completely dedicated to this one color. It's possible to make. Look at how similar that color is. Even though we took two entirely different colors to do this, it's still possible to match. So hopefully, armed with this color chart here, be able to have some fun with this really, really fun figure from Raging Heroes. As I let some parts of the wings dry, I'm going to throw some colors in a few different areas. Like, let's say we have the bodice here, which is going to get some of the emerald color. Mixed a little bit of the deep sky blue to make sure it was toned down just enough. So I'm just going to do that much with it. And I'm going to take that deep sky, mix it up. I don't really want to do non-metallic metal per se. What I just want to do is think about throwing some color on this, the end of this sword blade towards the hilt here. Same thing this way. See, on this side of the blade, leave the other side light. Bring that down. Take a slightly different green now. And I'll work the other side. Even use my finger to blend. There's nothing wrong with that. I just wanted to get it away from being just all so light, because it's all about blocking in not just your colors but your values. That's important to remember if you're gonna do the shaded base coat technique. You always have to think that I'm blocking in my colors where I think I want them to go, but also how light do I want an area to be? How dark do I want an area to be? So just to have this little reference on the sword is very handy. I'm going to take a few spots of the hair while I have a somewhat smaller brush and pick out some more targeted places for those to go. See, along this top edges of some of the wings, because if I don't see, well, how dark do I want these top edges to be, the lighter colors that are supposed to go in here, well, they're just not going to seem all that light, and I'll keep lightening them and realizing the reason they don't look light is because there's no dark color next to them. It's just a very important thing. So even here at this early stage out on the end of the wings, just want to at least indicate where there might be some darks. Over here where there is no indication, as I have nothing to compare these lighter colors to. I may even paint over some of these darker colors that I'm just painting on right now, but still it helps me set a context. This particular instance of Sheeted base coat is going to be a little more elaborate than on a typical miniature, because this is a somewhat larger figure. Obviously, this is the original figure you saw was on a 50mm round base. So it's definitely somewhat larger than what we've worked with on some of the other videos. But it seemed like this would help show the broadest range of greens. So that's why I chose that. We'll be doing much more with the darks in a later stage. That's going to be called glazing. And we'll explain that when we get to it. But even just this much, even adding this much to the shaded base coat, adding this little bit more of a context to the darks, it's a good indication of what I need to do now. Some of the lighter colors. Just get a little more of the here to throw in here. Again, not worried about the face at all. Gonna go back and get that later. Okay. So now I can grab some of my yellow again. And now we're gonna be a little more careful, a little more target. Still have the brush held on in the end here. That's not quite as wild and free with the brush strokes. You can see there's also still a lot of liquid in the paint. Because I'm still hoping actually to get somewhat blending. So see what happens. Watch what happens when two of these brighter colors meet. This is the emerald and the yellow. And what was once, that's kind of dead there. There's really not a lot of activity. All of a sudden, boom. That just got a lot more interesting right there. And it didn't take much. Didn't take much to enhance that area. And this looks that much brighter because I put some of the deep sky blue around it. I'm going to need to do the same thing on the other side. See if it happens. I can turn this upside down. Get some of the yellow down. There's still, see that the paint that's there is still somewhat on the wet side. It's letting me do some of that wet into wet blending. So I've got some of the yellows in here now. I can grab some of the emerald. Make that more intense green and add that in. Since the yellow is obviously definitely wet, can do some blending there as well. Carry this out towards the end of the wings. So that's one of the more dramatic effects of the shaded base coat, is to be able to do something like this, where we have something that looks kind of dead, like what's in here, and just kind of magically draw out much more color. Now I'm going to throw some of the deep sky blue out on the palette, and this will mix with some of the emerald, because remember we wanted the wings to be a little bit cooler out on the end, so we're mixing now a much cooler version of this color, and extend it out on the end of the wings here just a little bit. So we have this transition now from that warm to cool. It's just a fun thing. It gives the person looking at the miniature something to really see, instead of just, well, okay, the wing is green. Well, the wing is a lot more than green. There's this whole kind of rainbowy transition. Certainly much more exciting than this. So I'll turn this upside down. I guess what can happen too when people are trying out this technique for the first time, there's a little tendency to panic, I guess I would say, because it doesn't look like anything. It just looks like a mess of colors at first. But then as you start to build, all of a sudden you start to see the shapes form. So on the bodice here now, it's time to, while I have this color, throw some lights. A few little lights there. Might even take some of the Verdigris. And remember, this is all still blocking this in. So I'm not gonna get too much into shading there, just an indication. Here, I'm gonna indicate a few lights. This is the Verdigris now mixed with that blue sky / emerald mix. Stop there. So for some final kind of closing thoughts and details on this figure, you can see that I put in some more greens on the face, a little bit of kind of under the eye shadow there. Picked out a few details on the gemstones, the hands. What I had done again for this part was to take the filbert brush, as I done earlier in the glazing phase, and just go on over that lightly to bring back some of the dark lines. And then if I wanted to highlight it in places, I could take just a lighter green, mix that in, and then bring out a few lights here on these parts of the wings. That gives it a little more depth now.